My pleasure to moderate this panel. And I want to introduce you to Glenn Carl. Glenn Carl has been Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats. In that capacity, he led 16 agencies of the U.S. intelligence community in preparing the U.S. government's most senior assessments to threats to the United States, to the President, members of the Cabinet, and the nation's most senior military leaders. This is going to give us an excellent window into the nature of the threat, be able to help us understand the complexities of the threat assessment, and I think you're going to find that he's a tremendously good person to lead off our panel. So, Glenn, I'm going to ask you to go first. In just one second. Let me just quickly introduce the other two briefly, then I'll say it. Then we're going to switch over to a discussion of solutions. There's been no more popular solution to solving terrorism than leadership decapitation. Jenna Jordan is a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. She has completed a truly ambitious study studying nearly 300 efforts to decapitate terrorist leaders over the last 40 years. This is the largest study of its kind, and she's going to follow on. And then finally, we have another major issue, which is nuclear terrorism, and especially how do we think about nuclear terrorism? Well, to help us talk about that issue today, we are especially privileged to have Thomas Schelling. Thomas Schelling is one of the great figures, the great thinkers in American national security strategy pretty much for the last 50 years. Thomas Schelling and his work, both in the strategy of conflict and arms and influence, that's what earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005. It also, that work has earned him the respect of literally tens of thousands of folks who have come to Washington to work on these issues in those decades. People often ask me about nuclear terrorism because of the work I've done. I point them to this day to Thomas Schelling's 1982 piece in International Security. Now, he won't be talking about that piece because he's updated his thoughts since then. But he remains, I think, the best thinker on the subject. And so with no further ado, we're going to start with Glenn, go to Jenna, and then go to Tom.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be included with such a group of experts and to have a chance to share what little I know, or some little bit of what little I know. Secretary of State Kissinger, long ago, after he finished his service as Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, wrote that when he became Secretary of State for the first time, or National Security Advisor possibly, he thought, now I will have access to all the information, all the resources of the United States government. I'll learn new things, develop new perceptions. I'll be able to think strategically, think great thoughts, make great policy, and I'll be able to know what to do. But he said that all he could do during his terms of service was respond to crises and events, and that he had no time to think and doubted whether he had any new thought at all during his term of service, which is not a slight of him. It's a fact that anyone in a position of policymaking or as a government bureaucrat, since I was a bureaucrat certainly, struggles with the terror of the inbox, and we all come to be dominated by it to a large extent. My job and the job on the National Intelligence Council and the job of the National Intelligence Council itself, in its platonic ideal, really, is to raise our eyes and our perceptions and see, let's say, the flow of the river instead of the ripples on the surface, to the extent that we can. It's a luxury, it's an honor, it's really hard, but it's a lot of fun, and since that's the mission, we may succeed a little bit more, at least in attempting to have a different perspective than all of our colleagues and I, for most of my career, who are so terrorized by the inbox and the daily issues you have to respond to. That perspective, the mission of the National Intelligence Council, led me to focus in my work and my thinking more and more on paradigms and on perceptions, on ourselves, while doing our analysis of what al-Qaeda was up to, rather than just on reporting about the enemy. First, we have to understand how it is that how and why we see the reporting and the enemy as we do, and attempt to be conscious of what bounds and frames our perceptions. And only then can we really make a better sense of all the unbelievable amount of terrorist reporting that we receive and we collect and attempt to collate and interpret. So the title of this panel is Thinking Through the New Security Puzzle, Terrorism and Asymmetric Threats. But I would suggest that it might be more accurate or profitable for us to say or to think about misperceptions and lagging awareness, or trying not to choose the facts to fit our assumptions, assuming we can become aware of what our assumptions are. And that leads to, I spoke of the terror of the inbox, which is very hard to avoid, to the terror of terrorist threat reporting. When one first gains access to terrorism reporting, any sort of reporting, but the issue is terrorism reporting, it is overwhelming. Every day there are hundreds of reports, literally, that come in, ranging from across the entire spectrum. There is no threat whatsoever. We can all go to the beach. Every Muslim is a terrorist with an atomic bomb in his pocket, and everything between. And it's our job, of course, to sift through several hundred reports a day, each officer, and there are thousands of them, receiving several hundred reports a day, and to make sense of them, to identify what is wheat, what is chaff, what needs to be forwarded, and how to understand or interpret what it is we receive, assuming we've been able to identify the report that merits analysis and further work. What came from the overwhelming impression that terrorist reporting makes, particularly post 9/11, is the paradigm that we all know and that remains operative, even though it's been substantially modified and I would even say discredited. And that is, of course, that terrorism is one, Al-Qaeda and Islamic Jihad are basically synonyms, and that the threat is global, coherent, controlled. Link analysis is very important in intelligence work, and that there are links among terrorist groups in Indonesia and in Mauritania, and they're all controlled by some coherent, throbbing brain planner and so on, bin Laden or his organization. And that they're everywhere. They're here, they're there, they're who knows where. The rule of thumb figure given for years and years was, well, where is Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda operates in 80 countries in the world. That was the formal position. It was never true, but I won't go into the details at this point unless someone really would like me to. Then it was revised. Al-Qaeda is present in 60 countries. But that also is not true. And I'm not here to give a précis of Al-Qaeda itself, but the actual number has been basically 6 countries, 7 arguably, depending on definitions, where Al-Qaeda actually has had an operational presence. Now, the fact that they went through Grand Central Station at some point, you could say, well, they were present in the United States, but in fact, they're not operating there. So the paradigm, as I say, global, coherent, controlled, there are links and so on. This led to a reaction, understandable, that even the regional airport in Sunapee, New Hampshire is under threat of a terrorist attack, and we must protect everywhere at all times. And of course, anyone, and I'm not a career military person, will tell you that if you try to protect everything, you protect nothing. And it leads to for political reasons, which I understand, an almost inability to make discriminating choices and priorities. We have to spend as much on chemical control equipment in Fargo, North Dakota, as in Grand Central Station, say. This paradigm morphed over post 9/11, I would say in 2004, 2005 probably, became a bit more sophisticated or nuanced. And it said that, well, Al-Qaeda has franchised now. We've degraded Al-Qaeda Central. And they have branches, and these branches are linked, you know, because we know that Abdul Muhammad Abdul made a telephone call 6 years ago to Muhammad Abdul Muhammad in Indonesia, and so therefore the Al-Qaeda branch in Indonesia is linked with the GICM in Morocco, say. Ergo, they are part of and both of them sent someone several years prior to that to Tarnak Farms for training. Ergo, it's part of a coherent strategic operation. Each of those facts is true. It doesn't imply, and I think we've come to see, at least in the intelligence community, that a link, using the word link is a dangerous, heavily laden term because it implies or is taken to mean often a more coherent and direct strategic association than we found to be the case. But so it's franchised. It has branches now. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have become a global inspiration and motivators, and I think there's no question that that is true. Although I would say that that is true more from a sociological perspective, which is important and relevant to terrorism analysis, but more as a sociological phenomenon than as a leader pulling strings, issuing guidance, and so on. Although he tries, and he does some. And Al-Qaeda remains coherent and lethal, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I would say that this morphing and this franchising, or the inspiration, rather, that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden provide, it's more accurate to consider it like an Islamic Che Guevara. When I was in college, and probably still, classmates of mine would wear, I never did, Che Guevara T-shirts. He was a hero. He's a mensch. He's a leader. He opposes oppression. He fights for justice. He's against the system. He puts himself on the line. All of these things are hugely admirable. And people wear Che Guevara shirts, and they probably flirted with or sincerely were socialists or Marxists. That does not mean that the classmate of mine wearing a Che Guevara T-shirt was part of his cell or linked to him. I think the phenomenon of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and global jihad is very similar to that. I'm not a Pollyanna in dismissing it. It has had bad consequences and effects for U.S. interests, and I think we all think for everyone, really, and the Muslims most directly affected. But that's not the same phenomenon. It's a sociological one to which we need to respond. As we've heard from previous speakers, you use the term soft power or diplomacy and so on rather than kinetic means. And why has this happened? Why has bin Laden become this saint of jihad? And the cause and effect, as we saw with the data concerning suicide bombing, one can make the same point, whatever the subject under analysis with respect to terrorism, Islam, and jihad is, that, pardon me, it's happened because Islam is responding to current events and largely to actions that our government has taken in response to 9/11. There is a direct cause and effect. And I'm a strong proponent of course, we serve our national interest. There's no morality at all in foreign policy, and it's nice to hear that we have moral imperatives to help so-and-so in such and such a place. The fact is, it's more important to me, and I'm sure to all of us, that we preserve the life of the Iowa farm boy or South Boston longshoreman's son who is a soldier and advance American interests than that we sacrifice those lives to protect someone who doesn't have strategic interests or can advance American interests, worthy as their cause or sorry as their plight might be. This morphing view that, I'll finish in just a moment, that Al-Qaeda's branched leads to two important errors. It continues to imagine and impose a far more order and structure than there really is. And it's a key psychological point. It's human to perceive and impose structure on chaos. We cannot collate or interpret chaos, so we will project meaning onto what otherwise is incomprehensible events. And second, it minimizes and doesn't even include, this is critical, the local, regional, ethnic, historic, and culturally and geographically specific issues throughout the Muslim world that are the causes, the drivers, and the catalysts of most, not all, but most of what we call Islamic terrorism today. I'd add American policy too, and I'm not criticizing American policy, it is a consequence, as previous speakers said. So finally then, 30 seconds, what is the terrorist threat today? How should we approach it? Well, it's largely what it always has been prior to 9/11. There are small numbers of mostly disjointed men and small groups around the world hostile to America, responding to crises, responding to American actions. There is still Al-Qaeda Central that remains coherent, capable, and attempting to strike the United States, but it is the only Islamic organization in the world that exists that is consciously seeking to strike the homeland of the United States. That was true prior to 9/11. It is still true. The change is our actions overseas and the serious damage we have done to Al-Qaeda. And then there are numbers of disjointed individuals inspired by all these events also seeking to kill us. Thank you.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much. I know there are going to be a lot of questions about Glenn's talk, especially what's the difference in policy if it's 80 countries Al-Qaeda's in versus 6? That's a big question. But we're going to turn now to Jenna. Jenna, do you need the computer? Yeah, so I'll just bring it back up for you. And there you are.
Here we go. Okay, let me just move this up. Thank you for having me. It's really quite an honor to be here and to be amongst all these amazing speakers. It's been a really wonderful day. So my project looks at leadership decapitation of terrorist organizations. And when I say leadership decapitation, I'm referring to the arrest or killing of a leader, the top leader, or members of the upper echelon of a terrorist organization. And the reason I look at this is I think that leadership targeting has become a key feature of current counterterrorism policies. This slide actually shows the dramatic increase in decapitation over time. And I think this is due to the fact that both academics and policymakers have argued that the removal of leaders is an effective strategy in combating terrorism. However, leadership decapitation is not always successful, and I think most existing empirical work is insufficient to account for this variability. Most people believe that removing a group's leader will render it ineffective. And I believe this optimism is fueled by two basic assumptions. First, that terrorist organizations tend to be headed by charismatic leaders that are seen as inherently fragile because they depend upon one person with unique attributes. Since charisma is often associated with religiosity, this model would predict that religious groups should be the most vulnerable to decapitation, and accordingly, that organizational attributes, things like a group's size, age, or structure, are not so important. The other assumption is based on social network theory and is less specific to leaders and predicts more variability in the success of decapitation. The idea is that the removal of hubs, who are the actors with the most social ties, these are the actors that are critical to group communication, logistical support, and the distribution of information. So the removal of these leaders will disrupt organizational, or hubs, they may be leaders or not, will disrupt organizational planning and operations. So remove the right person, and the organization should be severely weakened. But we see that some groups, which have been consistently targeted, with little effect. So I ask whether decapitation is an effective counterterrorism strategy. So to answer this question, I constructed a data set of all incidents of leadership targeting from 1945 to 2004. This is almost 300 cases of various groups and in various contexts. And it turns out that the susceptibility of terrorist groups to decapitation is strongly predicted by organizational characteristics of size, age, and type. The larger and older, the more durable. Religious organizations are highly resistant to decapitation, and I'm going to explain these findings in more detail in just a minute. So in a nutshell, my analysis shows that decapitation does not work. It does not increase the likelihood of organizational collapse beyond a baseline. In fact, organizations that have not had their leaders removed are more likely to fall apart than those that have. So decapitation did succeed in 17% of these 298 cases that I look at. But this finding must be put in context. So I find that 53% of all terrorist groups that have been decapitated fell apart, while 70% of groups that have never experienced decapitation are no longer active. So decapitation is counterproductive. The marginal utility is actually negative. The rate of collapse is 20% less for decapitated groups. Now, this is not to say that decapitation never works. So in order to understand when decapitation is likely to be effective, I'm going to look at the marginal utility of decapitation for 3 different group characteristics: age, size, and then type. The data show that as a group becomes larger, decapitation is less likely to be effective. And this was actually the strongest statistical finding in my analysis. So looking at all cases of decapitation, the youngest groups, those under 10 years of age, fell apart nearly 30% of the time. In contrast, decapitation has never succeeded against groups over 40 years of age. So what this slide does, it compares the rate of decline based on group age for groups that have experienced leadership decapitation to those that have not. And the bottom row is basically the differential rate of decline for groups that have and groups that have not had their leaders removed. So the data shows, we can see up here, that groups under 20 years of age that have had their leaders removed fell apart 7% less often than those that did not. Once an organization crosses a threshold of 20 years, the likelihood that decapitation will fail more than doubles. Groups over 40 years of age are the most resistant to decapitation, and I think really most surprising here is that the lifespan of all organizations whose leaders have removed is likely longer than it would be otherwise, and this is especially true the older an organization becomes. Second, I looked at group size. For groups with fewer than 25 members, decapitation increases the odds of decline by 2%. Decapitation is 11% more effective for groups with between 26 and 100 members, and 5% more for groups with between 101 and 500 members. So I'm basically just going, across the chart here. However, once an organization exceeds a membership of 500, the utility of decapitation is always negative. So for groups with between 500 and 1,000 members, decapitated groups actually fall apart 46% less than they would otherwise. So this data also show that decapitation is counterproductive, particularly for the largest groups. And finally, as to type, I classified groups as religious, ideological, or separatist. And ideological refers to, sort of right-wing, left-wing, Marxist-Leninist groups, organizations like this, or a combination of these. So, for example, Hezbollah and Hamas are classified as both religious and separatist. Religious and separatist groups are the most resilient to decapitation, while ideological organizations are the easiest to destabilize. So ideological groups that have had their leaders removed fall apart about 7% less than those that did not. And we can see religious groups that have undergone decapitation are 15% less likely to fall apart than those that haven't. And separatist groups are about 30% less likely to cease activity than separatist groups that haven't been targeted. So what explains these findings? In order to understand why small, young, and ideological groups are easier to destabilize, I argue that organizational resilience, the ability of a group to withstand leadership attacks, depends on 2 factors: bureaucratization and communal support. Bureaucratization explains the resilience of large and old organizations, while communal support accounts for the resilience of religious and separatist groups. First, well-developed bureaucracies allow an organization to continue operating and to replace its leadership after decapitation. If there's a structural hierarchy at the upper levels of the organizational administration, then there should be clear processes of succession when the leader's removed. And second, support from the community in which the group operates is critical to organizational capacity. Groups depend upon the support of the local population in order to gain the resources necessary to operate and survive. Small, isolated groups are more dependent upon leadership than what I would say larger integrated groups, which require sort of leadership to sort of access these important resources. Those more smaller, isolated groups are sort of more dependent upon leadership in order to gain access to these important resources. Well, religious and separatist groups are sort of deeply rooted in their local communities. So generally, these groups tend to have a greater degree of local support and are thus more resilient. So, in conclusion, I'm just wrapping it up here. The findings of this project, I think, demonstrate the need to develop new counterterrorism policies. In many circumstances, decapitation is likely to be ineffective and can actually be counterproductive by increasing communal support, and particularly when we see instances of leadership targeting that have resulted in the killing of civilians. Furthermore, groups are capable of learning and adapting, and actually I think decapitation in certain cases can result in a stronger organizational capacity. And finally, I just want to say I think that one really important implication that can be drawn from this study is that eliminating bin Laden is unlikely to affect the operational capacity of al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda formed in 1988, is over 20 years of age, has over 500 active members, and is religious. And the data that I find would suggest that decapitation is unlikely to work in this particular case. So I think overall we really need to sort of rethink, seriously consider whether the groups that we're targeting are the groups against whom decapitation will actually work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. That was profoundly helpful in understanding what we're up against. I'd now like to change gears and have us rethink nuclear terrorism with Tom Schelling.
Looks like it. Can you hear me? Good. Our host mentioned an article of mine in 1978. I'd like to quote you the first sentence of that article. Sometime in the 1980s, an organization that is not a national government will acquire a nuclear weapon. The second sentence was, if not in the 1980s, then in the 1990s. Well, that was 32 or 33 years ago. It hasn't happened as far as we know, and I think if it had happened, we would know it. I want to talk about three things. One is how a terrorist organization could get the stuff, the high-enriched uranium or the plutonium, fissile material of weapons grade, how they would get hold of it. Second, how they would get the people to make the bomb. I think it's so unlikely that they would acquire a real bomb that we don't need to bother to talk about it. If you want to ask me about that later, I can answer it. Then the third question, which I also took up in that article, was what would they use it for? To blow up Los Angeles or Berlin or Tel Aviv? First, most of the discussion about the possible acquisition of nuclear weapons material has to do with getting it from the original location where it was kept. How good is the custody, the security? And the Nunn-Lugar program, named for Senators Nunn and Lugar, sometimes known as the Nuclear Threat Reduction Program, has been in effect for almost 20 years, and it's been, I think, highly effective in various respects. But still, most people who study the situation think that security, wherever weapons-grade material is kept, is not good enough. Not nearly good enough. It isn't even known for sure where all the stuff is in the former Soviet Union. I think focus on how to steal the stuff misses what may be the most difficult part of getting fissile material from its original custody into the hands of a group that is capable of using it. Just by coincidence, yesterday, my former colleague Peter Diamond was one of 3 people awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. And the work for which it was provided was what is called market search. How does somebody who has something to sell find somebody who wants to buy it? Well, if it's a common item, you can advertise it, you can open up a storefront, you can locate intermediaries who know the field. But if the thing we're talking about is very rare, almost unique, if it's exceedingly valuable, worth your life perhaps, and if its possession is illegal, you may have a hard time disposing of it after you've stolen it. This used to be the problem 30 years ago that pornographers had in reaching the kids who wanted to buy the pornography. How do you advertise without getting caught? If you have just stolen a Picasso from an art museum, you can't very well go to the Financial Times and put in a notice that you'll take $60 million for it, no questions asked. Somebody's likely to show up on your doorstep before the customer arrives. And I think that thinking about how somebody who is in a position to steal the stuff can get it to somebody who wants to give it to a team who can convert it into a nuclear weapon means going through a whole chain of separate links, each one of which may be difficult to negotiate. The person who can get hold of this stuff may not have any idea how you smuggle that kind of thing out of the country that he's in. He may not have any good idea of what the likelihood is that radiation detectors will catch him on the way out. He may not know whom to entrust to try to get it to the terrorist organization. More likely, he will hope that the terrorist organization has financed somebody who will come to him and take it off his hands for money. But then he's got to worry that the amount of money might be such that whoever takes it off his hands would rather kill him than pay him once he's got his hands on it. Then that person has to go find somebody else. He can't just buy an airplane ticket to Afghanistan or Pakistan and go to the nearest policeman and say, "Can you tell me how to find Osama bin Laden?" It won't work that way. So if you think through the problem, how can you go through what may involve half a dozen intermediaries in order to reach the intended purchaser, where people speak different languages and have different customs and all of that? I think it becomes easy to recognize that it may be hard for the would-be producer of a nuclear weapon to work the whole chain of events, particularly if it is known that something is missing, so that people are on guard to look for it. So that my hope is, I have no knowledge of this. I've never had a security clearance in the last 40 years, but I trust that at least the Israeli Mossad, or the Russian equivalent of the KGB, and actually I hope the CIA or some undercover U.S. intelligence agency is perpetually in the market, either pretending it has something to sell or pretending there's something it wants to buy. I think this is known as a sting operation, and it seems to me that the most likely way to prevent fissile material from reaching any organization like Al-Qaeda is to have people so numerous in the market, either pretending to have something to sell or having the money with which to buy, that people would find it very difficult, may not even have the courage to try to make contact with a potential seller or a potential buyer. My fantasy is that a potential buyer and a potential seller jockey around dance around with each other, finally getting together in order for one of them to make the purchase and the other to make the sale. And they each have passwords according to which it turns out one of them is from the Israeli Mossad and the other is from the CIA, and they have to go back and start all over again. Anyway, now let me talk about the problem of getting the people. My understanding is that it takes at least half a dozen exceedingly well-trained scientists as a team to work together to put together a nuclear weapon once they have adequate fissile material. In addition to half a dozen extremely well-educated scientists, the kind that come from MIT and Caltech and a few other such places, you need a pretty large number, a team of what you might call artisans, people who know how to use equipment in order to construct things with a very high tolerance, and in order to put together something as delicate as a mechanism that will not only be a bomb that will explode when you want it to, but that won't explain when you don't want it to. And now my impression is that this team is going to have to spend upwards of 6 weeks, maybe 6 months, making a bomb or a few bombs, depending on how much fissile material they have. Now, these are going to have to be people who, either voluntarily or having been kidnapped, will be taken blindfolded to some place or away from their families and away from their jobs. They will work together as a team, hopefully as a happy team, which means that maybe kidnapping isn't such a good idea. One question is, how do you find those people? Again, there's a problem. If you approach a PhD in computer science and say, we'd love to have you come and help make a nuclear bomb, what we'll do is blindfold you and take you to some country. You won't know what the country is, and out in a remote place, you'll be part of a team that we will pay very well if you will help us design and put together this nuclear weapon. And I think if I were that computer scientist, I would think, once I've helped them build the bomb, why, instead of paying me what they promised, don't they just bury my body in the backyard? Then I can't go to the CIA and collect another $1 million for telling them all about it. So I think it's going to be hard to recruit people unless there just happen to be available the appropriate nuclear engineers and computer scientists and chemists and mathematicians and so forth who could be counted on to be loyal to the organization. Even then, if they're smart, they may recognize that it's easier to kill them than to trust them after they've done their job. So I think that getting the team together is almost as difficult as getting the material in the first place. Then I asked myself, suppose you do have a team that believes in the project, believes in the organization, and wants to help, and thinks that terrorism has a role to play in getting Americans out of other countries and things of that sort. What does this team talk about at supper every night? They can't call the children and talk to them. They can't get on email and talk to anybody. They can play music. Maybe they can watch some television. But mainly, here's a bunch of people, and my guess is that the scientists, that is the upper echelon people, will sit around a table of no more than 6 to 8, 10 or 12 people, and another 50 people will be in more of a dining hall together. But these PhDs are likely to talk about what can this weapon be used for. And I have a hunch that at the end of the first 6 weeks, they will have thought more about that question than any terrorist in the world, or almost any nuclear weapons policy strategist in the world, and certainly more than any head of government in the world will have had time to talk about what would somebody do if he had a nuclear weapon. My guess is, and I invite you to speculate, my guess is that these people will decide It would be kind of a waste to kill 250,000 people in Los Angeles or a bunch of Germans in Hamburg. They may think about whether it would serve any purpose to kill 250,000 Jews in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. Jerusalem would run the risk that a large fraction of the people killed would be Palestinians and not Jews. It might occur to them that this terrorist organization is about to become either the 10th or the 11th nuclear power. And using that power may make more sense than spending it just to produce 250,000 dead bodies in some Western city. They will decide that maybe we will use this for influence. After all, except for the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in 1945, all the nuclear weapons so far have been used, if used at all, for influence, sometimes called deterrence, sometimes called coercion. And you don't want to overestimate how good deterrence has worked. Nuclear weapons have I would say, an excellent record of deterrence between the major East-West powers. But nuclear weapons didn't deter the North Koreans in 1950, didn't deter the Chinese at the end of that year, may have deterred the Chinese when they were about to attack Formosa. Nuclear weapons didn't deter anything in Vietnam. Nuclear weapons didn't deter Syria and Egypt in 1973. Nuclear weapons didn't deter the British in their war when their island was attacked by Argentina. Nuclear weapons didn't deter an uprising in Afghanistan where the Soviets thought they were in charge. So nuclear weapons don't have a perfect record of deterrence. Nevertheless, if they've accomplished anything, it's been deterrence, except for the 2 in Japan, and perhaps even the 2 in Japan were effective less because they killed so many people than because the Japanese assumed that if we had 2, in time we could have a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th, a 6th, and so forth, so that maybe that was an advertisement for deterrence. And then the question arises, if this organization has a nuclear weapon, how does it prove it? If it says Americans get out of Afghanistan by next New Year's Eve, or will blow up Los Angeles, how do we know they actually have a weapon? I think that's an overcomable problem. There was a time when Fidel Castro wasn't taken seriously enough by the U.S. government because they thought he was just a fringe leader of a very modest uprising. Fidel Castro arranged to have a journalist, a well-known woman journalist, kidnapped, taken to his place in the forests of Cuba, gave her free rein to look around at everything going on for about a week, then blindfolded her again and took her back to where she came from, and she was then able to be an eyewitness for the fact that he had a much better trained, better organized little army than anybody had believed before. Well, I once talked to a friend of mine at Stanford University who was a nuclear weapons designer originally, and I asked him whether he would volunteer to be kidnapped if a terrorist organization wanted him to see exactly what they had so that he could, with his own judgment, report home whether or not they had a nuclear weapon. And he decided that he obviously ought to do that because if they did have such a weapon, it would be important for the U.S. government to know that they had it. And if he could detect that it wasn't a workable device, that would be worth finding out and knowing. He wouldn't necessarily need to tell them that he thought it was unworkable. So I think I've talked about this once with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and his idea was, well, before they start threatening things, they're going to have to blow up one weapon to prove they have it. And I think that's one way to prove it, but especially if you have only one, you may not want to blow it up. I remember that President Truman had a recommendation that he should explode one nuclear weapon as a demonstration so that they would believe that it worked. And he had to worry first that it might not work, and that would be a bad display. And second, that he only had two, and he thought he wasn't sure that he wanted to use up one just to persuade the Japanese. And anyway, I think these people, if they have one or two or three, can find a way to demonstrate that they have it. And then my thought is that probably what they would do would be to make a demand on the United States. Let's say they want the U.S. out of Afghanistan. They say, we have one nuclear weapon. It is already located in one American city. Here is a list of 10 cities. In one of them, there's the bomb. Boston, Baltimore, Charleston, South Carolina, Houston, Los Angeles, Seattle, you name it. And that bomb will go off early in the morning next New Year's Day if the U.S. troops aren't out of Afghanistan. And then what happens is that if they make that known to the American public, if the U.S. isn't out of Afghanistan by about Christmas, tens of millions of people will evacuate their homes in order to see which one of the cities gets blown up. That would be a very effective threat to make. It's just one of many that I think they could think of if they're sitting around this team of people discussing the most important thing in their lives, and they may have a variety of ideas about how this weapon can be used for all kinds of good purposes, including perhaps purposes that get worldwide support. I'll give you one more example and then I'll shut up. In that article I mentioned, I asked, what could a terrorist organization have done, either a Palestinian organization or any pro-Palestinian terrorist organization? What would they have done if they had a nuclear weapon? At that time, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Israelis depended very, very much on U.S. resupply of ammunition, spare parts, and equipment. And not a single NATO country would allow the U.S. air supply to land and refuel anywhere in Europe, Portugal included. But Portugal controlled the Azores and was willing to let the United States refuel at a big airfield in the Azores. And by refueling in the Azores, the U.S. was able to supply approximately twice as much as it could have supplied if it couldn't refuel. And therefore, I thought that if this terrorist organization said, we have already introduced a nuclear weapon into the vicinity of that airfield, if the refueling doesn't stop within a week, we blow up the airfield. Everybody is hereby warned to evacuate. At that point, I thought, if either the Americans or the Portuguese government or the people who man the airfield decide that the refueling will stop, it would stop. And then they would advertise that all they had accomplished was to keep the United States, which had no business in the Middle East, from participating actively in a war which wasn't any of their business. And I thought quite likely they will not only stop the refueling, but they will get universal credit for having not blown up any civilians or anything of the sort, but simply forced the United States to stop aiding the other side in a war. Anyway, that's my pitch, and I hope you can think about it.
Excellent, Tom. We're going to take some questions. Thank you so much. And we have a number of provocative issues here on the table. Al-Qaeda was not in 80 places, but 6. Leadership decapitation, even of Osama bin Laden, unlikely to be very effective. And we aren't thinking seriously enough about nuclear terrorism because we're so scared we're not thinking through the problem. Yes, sir.
Mohammed Qasim. I'm really fascinated by this figure about Al-Qaeda. It's just a scare tale as far as I'm concerned. Don Leone Panettone, the capo de capi over at Langley, said it's 100. And General Jones said 60. Are we scared of 60 Wahhabis? Are we thinking 60 Wahhabis, all the damn people, are going to have a nuclear weapon? I asked a Pakistani boy, why are you wearing this T-shirt with Osama bin Laden? He said, because it scares the Americans in the army. It's a very potent term. On decapitation, I'm inspired.
Well, actually, just could we limit it to one question?
Yeah, okay.
I want to get as many in as possible.
Yeah, why are we not clear about the number of Wahhabis in Al-Qaeda? And why are we using this term to scare people?
Excellent, sir. Thank you. Glenn, or anybody around? If you read it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Number of Wahhabis?
Yeah, you could take this.
The issue of how large is Al-Qaeda and where are they has been a contentious one since well before 9/11. And it's, as with any intelligence subject, you will have, as I mentioned, the entire spectrum of answers provided each day in reporting. So it comes to interpretation, analytical skill and ability, and then debates as the assessments move their way up the chain of command.
Very good. Sir.
Thank you. David Mercer, Mercer & Associates. And my question goes to Jenna and to you as well, Bob, on both your subject matters. In thinking about how, whether decapitation or occupation or what have you, in dealing with terror, whether you found in a comparative analysis any value in looking at IRA or ANC and other efforts in that regard, and how they compare, and why we haven't heard that at all today in terms of a comparison.
Jenna, please.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are cases where it has been successful for sure. So my study, at least the statistics that I'm talking about, are really just looking kind of at all cases across the board. So generally, these are the things that we find. So of course there are exceptions. I've looked at a few other cases kind of more in depth. So in order to understand, like for example, decapitation ultimately was effective against a group like Shining Path in Peru. So I sort of then go inside the case and try to find, well, what is it about this organization that ultimately made them, susceptible? And sort of in my research, I find that a lot of it, what it comes down to is kind of these two causal logics that I'm talking about, which is, level of bureaucratization or degree of communal support. And I think that a lot of the susceptibility we can trace to variation in the, in kind of the structure of the organization at the upper levels, how cohesive it is, how organized it is, its capabilities, its degree of specialization. And then on the other end, sort of variation in degree of support for the group over time. So I think that, some of this variation can really be captured by looking at kind of the story inside the organization. I hope that answers your question.
And if that question for me was why some occupations and not others, the answer is that there are additional risk factors that make some occupations worse. Some have to do with the intensity and atrocities, but there's a special one I want to call attention to, which is the social distance between the occupier and the local community. The broader the distance, the more likely the local community is to fear losing its way of life. And by the way, one of the best indicators of distance are different religions. So that's why we so often see occupations where we have different religions between occupier and occupied escalating. Anyway, I'll just stop there. But we can take one more question. Yes, sir, right here. Ezra in the middle.
Yeah, one more question about decapitation. You looked mostly at whether the organization would collapse. What about losing effectiveness, even temporarily? Is that part of what you look at, or is that for your next study? Or
No, that's actually a great question. I've been criticized for having too sort of strict a measure of success. So basically, in my study, an organization has to essentially be inactive for 2 years in order for it to count as a success. And one of the reasons I do this is kind of in order to make policy prescriptions. And that every 2 years, foreign terrorist organizations are redesignated. So I kind of wanted to have some sort of policy relevance. But I do also look at sort of a few organizations more in depth, in order to look at changes in the lethality and frequency of attacks over time. So what I find is that there actually is a lot of variation amongst the cases that I looked at, but generally it's actually kind of interesting. I have to look at this sort of more extensively, but in the few cases I've looked at, what we find is that generally organizations become, attacks can become more frequent and or more lethal just following instances of decapitation. So I think a lot of this might be due to, sort of retaliatory motives of groups. It can embolden people to, join organizations, things like that. So, but there, of course, is variation, and that's actually something that I sort of intend to my book, ideally, to look more at the variation in the frequency of attacks and lethality of attacks.
Well, our next panel is in the wings, but please join me in thanking our current panel.
Thank you so much.